Hello and welcome to That Encyclopedia Podcast with your hosts, me, Will, and Jacob.
Hello.
Welcome again. Welcome back. Today we are discussing the genre of legends, crime fiction, which is a sort of very broad concept encompassing detective stories, murder mysteries, police, courtroom dramas as well, and legal thrillers. So this is a genre that's been around for hundreds of years and has to be one of the most popular genres of fiction of all. Wouldn't you think so?
I would say so. It's the kind of genre that's emerged independently across cultures. The article stresses, for example, that the earliest known example of crime fiction is not actually Western fiction at all, but 1001 Nights, also known as Arabian Nights. That was a collection of folk tales from various oral sources compiled in Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age. So it's the idea of mystery and the allure of someone rebelling against accepted norms, be it in an evil way or in a more sort of morally grey way, has been something that I think is timeless, and so I think crime fiction will live on forever, basically.
Yes, I was really intrigued reading about the early crime fiction examples from 1001 Nights, because especially the sort of subgenre of the whodunit, which obviously propelled to sort of cult-like success by authors such as Agatha Christie in the West. There is obviously this example from the old medieval Arabic tale called the Three Apples, and that is also reasonably considered a whodunit with multiple plot twists and elements of detective fiction. So yeah, as you were saying, the fact that this is a genre that's sort of come up in more than one place and spans more than 100 years in history. It's clearly very popular inherently. There's something about crime fiction that just works. So maybe I'll speak a little bit more on the Three Apples, because it gives a little bit of a summary of the sort of plot and setup. So sure. This is the one of the tales narrated by this narrator character in 1001 Nights. I'm going to mispronounce her name, so do you want to have a go?
Oh dear me, I can try. I would say Scheherazade. Yeah, I don't know whether it's I don't know. The problem with foreign names that have been kind of translated into English is it's never quite clear how the translation kind of customs, or how many translation customs have been activated in the attempt. So for example, this name ends Zade. So would you pronounce it Zaid? That sounds to me almost too English. So I might say something like Zade, but then no idea. But I would say Scheherazade or Scheherazade or something like that. But go for it.
Yeah. So we'll move from there. She is a storyteller character in 1001 Nights. So yeah, it's quite a nice framing. So because obviously these are all scribed versions of the oral tradition, the classical tales, and she is the one telling most of them, of which 1001 is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I believe there are some versions that pack that many stories in, but not the original. In this story, The Three Apples, there is a fisherman who discovers a heavy locked chest along a river, the Tigris River, which is one of the defining features of Mesopotamia. He sells this locked chest to a great leader, Harun al-Rashid, who has it broken open, and inside they find, dun dun dun, the dead body of a young woman cut into pieces. So Harun, the leader and owner of this chest now, orders his advisor, his vizier, to solve the crime and find the murderer. But he adds a little bit of a requirement, a pretty hard requirement there. Find the murderer within 3 days or be executed. So it's sort of it's an interesting.
It's a bit
motive.
harsh, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think modern police work might see a problem with threatening execution to someone who fails to produce a culprit in an arbitrary period of time.
Yeah, so obviously one might imagine a number of ways in which this could go wrong. But what it does do in this story is create an interesting sort of relationship between the detective of the story and his motive for solving the crime, because it's maybe not quite the same as for other famous characters like Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes doesn't solve crimes simply so he doesn't die. He solves them because he sort of wants to, for a more for broader personal reasons. You might say he has a more personal interest in in helping those who are victims of the crime. But I think that's just a really interesting, idea for a story. So yeah, that's the first one. There are a number of others within 1001 Nights that sort of fit the crime fiction category. But yeah, so crime fiction is very broad, and one of the things that is sort of interesting as a sort of a branching paths moment is there's a section of categories within crime fiction, of which there are many, and there's obviously overlap between lots, but it's got such potential as a genre.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to talk a bit about Sherlock Holmes at some point, but maybe but once I get going, I probably won't stop. So we'll maybe start with these categories. I'll really quickly just list them out for everyone. So the Wikipedia article identifies maybe about a dozen or so categories that all fall into this broad basket of crime fiction. And they are detective fiction, the cozy mystery, whodunit, the historical whodunit, locked room mystery, the hard-boiled, especially the American kind of hard-boiled noir-style detective, the police procedural, the forensic crime, the legal thriller, spy novels, the caper story, which is kind of the reverse, where you tell the crime from the perspective of the criminal, the psychological thriller, the parody, of course, and kind of then just miscellaneous, anything that doesn't quite fall into that. Of those, do you have a preference for any particular one, or any examples that you've enjoyed, gone against your expectations?
This goes without saying, and applies to every genre. I should read more, because my exposure to this type of fiction, like for most, is through TV and film. But that said, I have read some of the Jack Reacher, some of the Jack Reacher franchise, which where to put that. I don't know if that fits under the. It is a thriller, so it's not a psychological thriller, but it's a thriller relating to the solving of crimes. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Jacob.
I recognise the name, but I haven't read it myself.
It's on. I think there's a series. There's a series now on Amazon Prime. If you'd rather watch it than read it. But yeah, that's more. It's more of a. It's got more violence in it. It's got the guy who's sort of doing the investigating isn't himself, officially part of the legal system. So that's cool in a way. Sort of the thriller vibes, the unsentimental, violence and sex side of things. But I'd have to say, I do enjoy the sort of traditional, I guess, whodunit sort of setting now. I've watched a bucket load of Hercule Poirot, so that really, that's now even scores nostalgia points for me as well. But that's just, it's good for multiple ages as a genre, when it doesn't focus too much on violence or like any theme that can't be really shown in detail to young people, but focuses a lot on the relationship between characters, including those great protagonists like Hercule Poirot, like Sherlock Holmes with their interesting quirks.
It's interesting. Just because you mentioned a character like Poirot, right? And he is timeless, along with someone like Sherlock Holmes, to the extent that there are still productions being put on, whether it's in the theatre or in cinema or on TV, that feature the characters. I saw a trailer the other day that I thought was just a kind of slightly naff supernatural thriller, because the trailer is designed to look like that for the first 85%, and then in the final moments of the trailer, before the title is revealed, it's called A Haunting in Venice. It's being released, I think, later in the year. Suddenly, it's just Poirot standing in a bathroom, and you realise it's not a cheap horror film at all, but it's a Hercule Poirot movie, and it completely took me aback. And it's a clever trailer because it's very subversive by leaning so heavily into the classic cheap, almost Hollywood style horror tropes, only to reverse it at the last moment with the introduction of a timeless character that makes you reflect on everything you just watched. And I went back and watched the trailer again with the knowledge that it's now a Poirot film, and it suddenly looked really different. The power of a character like that can really influence how you interpret even a pretty standard piece of fiction otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen some of the recent... I can't remember what his name is, but there have been some recent Poirot films. I guess this is the next in that saga of movies. I saw Murder on the Nile, and I think they redid Orient Express as well. They're okay, but there's some really classic Poirot renditions out there. The ABC Murders, that was a pretty good one. Obviously, I'm talking about I don't know whether it was released on TV or in cinema first, so that's why I'm struggling to give it a name. But obviously, I'm not just talking about the book. These books are around, and I suppose it would be interesting to read one to see whether it comes across any differently. But yeah, the nature of them is this idea of a complex, plot-driven story where you get sort of teased with clues, and you meet lots of interesting and bizarre characters from which you sort of theorize oh, could this be the perpetrator? And then the solution is revealed at the end. Often in Poirot's case, he will straight up monologue to a room filled with suspects and just explain how the crime happened, and that's pretty much the end of every Poirot that I've seen.
The thinking man's sort of film, right, where it gives you a chance to figure it out yourself, or it should, in theory, and then after a period of reflection, you are either vindicated or the film catches you up by just having the brilliant detective exposit to the camera and everyone else in the room of exactly how it happened.
Well, that's where the criticism can come in, as you allude to. Yeah, you should, in theory, be given a chance to have reasonable clues that you can piece together what might have happened. That's certainly not always the case, and I think that's where, if you're critical of renditions of whodunits or even their original material, it can become potentially underwhelming if you're putting a little bit, if you are putting the effort in to try and solve the mystery, and you connect what you saw and what you were thinking about with the grand reveal at the end. Oftentimes there's little bits, little details that you just will not be fed or you will not sufficiently have information that, like, any one theory is any better than any other theory. Part of that might be a little cheeky suspense thing where a character, maybe Poirot, finds something, or Poirot arranges a conversation with someone, and then they don't actually show you the conversation, or he looks at a note and you see him holding a note, but you don't see the note. It could be anything like that. Any point in the story that you might be teased with a clue and not actually given the full clue, so you don't actually have everything to work with, which kind of forces you into that place of blind speculation, which can be fun, but sometimes if you are just not fed the whole thing, maybe you could accuse it of being a little bit of a cheat there.
Yeah, and this is actually where I segue into Sherlock Holmes, but specifically I guess it's a little bit out of date now, but the relatively recent BBC Sherlock series that ran for, I think, for 4 seasons, 4 series, and I think it's the 3rd episode of the first series, where Sherlock is busy doing something, and so the death of a celebrity host, talk show host, I think, is investigated by Watson instead. And you spend a lot of time with Watson by himself as he interviews people at the estate and gathers evidence and makes observations, that sort of thing, and then returns to HQ and shares his conclusion with Sherlock. And Sherlock, just out of hand, says something like, "No, completely wrong. I have a friend from the Home Office or something who sent me this file, which clearly shows it was this person instead responsible." And it's kind of portrayed almost as like a mockery of Watson, in my opinion, and it kind of made me raise eyebrows, because precisely that withholding of information that you were discussing can be abused. And in that particular episode, it's not the primary plot of the episode, and I think it's meant to be a bit humorous. But in my opinion, that particular presentation of Sherlock Holmes lent into that too much, where he's almost like a superhero, and his intelligence and his ability to draw conclusions is not refined and practiced and achievable for the audience watching and wanting to solve it with the detective, but instead it's just some superpower, and some crimes are so great or so complex that you need to plug the information into Sherlock's brain to get the answer out, and no one else has even the chance of solving it, and so the series doesn't allow you the chance to solve it by withholding that information for later. So while it can be effective in moderation, I'm a bit wary of it now, and I much rather, or I much prefer stories that do give you that chance fairly and legitimately.
Yeah. I mean, has to be fun if you know you had a chance, because maybe one day you'll have a good guess. Have you seen the Sherlock Holmes board game?
I haven't. I mean, I'm sure there's more than one. What happens if you play the Sherlock Holmes board game?
Well, what happens is the more you play it, the more you become slightly underwhelmed, I'll tell you. So, because the board game sort of relies upon cases that exist within a little book of cases, and they help guide how each time you play the game it works. So you're actually attempting to sort of solve a case, but it goes sort of, the early cases give you a decent amount of exposition on a crime and clues that might be say a phrase from Shakespeare or something, but relating to a choice of weapon or something, and they might have some sort of plot relevant reason to be there. You might find a note with something on it. Will describe you actually finding clues in the world. But I found more and more that you go into it, the later cases are just word puzzles with pretty much no story connecting them. The case number 15 will just be there's been a murder at this place, these are the suspects. You go to a scene, and then the clue is just a word clue. There's literally no snippet of story with it, and then you just solve a couple word puzzles and then you win. Which is kind of weird how it just evolves from that to the other thing. And then the other side of it is that it uses, even in the story-based ones, it uses some tropes that are I'm not familiar with, because I'm not super aware of the old Sherlock Holmes fiction, but tropes such that you can sort of guess the answer without having solved all the clues if you're aware of this trope. So yeah, I mean, I'm not giving it an amazing review, but if you meet someone who has it, see if you can play one of the early cases, or if not, just give it a browse, because it's an interesting concept for a game. I wonder if it could be done slightly better.
Well, thank you for the recommendation. I think the other thing that I think is relevant to the discussion of crime fiction is a point that was actually raised by Edgar Allan Poe, although Edgar Allan Poe didn't raise it in a critical sense, but as an advocate, but at least wrote it down explicitly. So for people who don't know, Edgar Allan Poe was an American author who had a rather difficult life, and is best known as sort of the author of The Raven, which is an extended poem, and certain horror mystery short stories and poems. But he also wrote detective fiction, and in fact he's credited with the first modern detective short story, which is called The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in 1841. And Murders in the Rue Morgue basically depicts two women who have been murdered in Paris, and a detective called C. Auguste Dupin, who is ultimately responsible for solving the murders. And Edgar Allan Poe utilizes this trope a lot in his works, where the victim is basically some young, beautiful woman. And he actually wrote an essay discussing this, whose name escapes me because it's been ages since I I read it, but it's a trope called "The Death of a Beautiful Woman," and the philosophy of composition. That's what it's called. He wrote an essay in 1946 called "The Philosophy of Composition," where he basically argued that the most, unquestionably, the most poetical topic in the world, the thing that's guaranteed to attract, praise from critics and adoration and attention from the public, is the death of a beautiful woman. And this ties itself quite neatly into the genre of crime fiction, of course, because it just means that you have to make your crime involve the death of a beautiful woman in some way. And personally, I feel that regardless of the veracity of this claim, with respect to sales and attention and so forth, regardless of the veracity of this claim, it's a little bit cheap these days, because it's so restrictive to the genre, but you do see it all the time. I guess an element of this is just going to be, a coin toss, right? Like, one of the most intriguing and disturbing crimes is murder, and, if you murder someone, you can basically just toss a coin, and fair enough. But even still, I just think that Poe was making a valid point. He was just making it from the wrong side of the argument. What do you think your thoughts on this are?
I think it's interesting. It's interesting that the interpretation of murder can be vastly different and of different levels of poetic epicness depending on who the victim is. that is interesting.
I think it is true.
I would say
historically.
it doesn't really fit with a ultra progressive worldview.
No, absolutely not. But it's. I think historically it has been kind of true in the sense that that's how the trope's been utilised through history, right? And not just in crime fiction.
Yeah.
Like if women with weak constitutions, like Victorian fainting disease, who are so too beautiful for this world, almost kind of that reverence for the perfect form that invites this terminal doom further down the line, because anyone so angelic is unable to exist in such an imperfect world, and isn't that terrible, and that sort of thing. It's very high drama, high art, and it's, as you say, I don't think it's particularly progressive these days.
I mean, I guess it's also interesting because by far the most likely victims of murder are actually men. But then there's the other case of my understanding of crime and mortality. I would expect that the sort of expected or average victim of one motive of murder would be different from another motive of murder, because obviously there's homicide as a broad category, but then, for example, if you look at domestic violence or murders between two partners, I believe in that case women are more likely to be murdered. So, but then that's not necessarily super relevant to which kind of stories resonate with people. I just thought that's somewhere my mind was going was who is the most likely murder victim, and what people read about vary from that.
I mean, it must be contextualized in what makes something suspenseful and compelling as well, right? Like,
yes,
if it's just two drunk guys, arguing outside a pub, and one decks the other, and he cracks his head open on the pavement and dies. That's, I mean, to be fair, that's probably more like manslaughter. But a situation like that isn't particularly compelling.
No,
because
like
it's not.
Yeah.
Whereas those sort of more intimate, deeply personal motivations that are more long term,
Yes.
I guess, are more conducive to a detective mystery.
Now, of course, there are murders based around drugs and debt, But at the end of the day, I think people find it more interesting if the murderer and the person in debt were also two people where you would not necessarily have expected it. Like a wealthy man is murdered because he is in debt, or the other, something else. Whereas, that probably differs from most real life murder, where it might be two unfortunate people in unfortunate circumstances with a fairly straightforward motivation.
Well, I just very briefly want to advocate for my favourite subgenre of crime fiction, which is the Scandinavian noir genre, which has become very popular on Netflix as like limited run TV series, I think. It's sort of the premise where you have, small sleepy towns. Everyone kind of knows each other, but not in the same way that a family or a household would in like an English country Agatha Christie style. And it's dark because it's always the winter in Scandinavia, and it's cold, and the murder, the blood is so highly contrasted with the snow and that sort of thing. And everything is bleak and grey, and everyone is so deadpan all the time that when it sneaks its way into other works of fiction, I find it almost funny. And my go-to example is the Netflix series Dark, which is kind of set and made in Germany, not in Scandinavia, but I think it still qualifies for that North Germanic kind of style, where the first season, without giving too much away, starts as a noir style piece of crime fiction, the investigation of disappearances and murders and stuff. And by the end of the first season, when like time travel has been well established and things are just appearing all over the town and like black holes appear in the sky and that sort of thing, everyone, like the detective and everyone in the town, is just staring at it like, yeah, that checks out. Like no really emotional reaction at all. I love the consistency that brings, and I find it quite funny in a way. But that's what I would advocate on my soapbox.
No, it sounds like a good setting. It's like a similar to sort of a large family or a bunch of people that used to go to public school together, the kind of thing that you might find in an Agatha Christie, but a slightly different setting. We are running out of time, but it did inspire me and remind me of something that sort of, and this does come up. It's come up in Poirot. I've seen it come up in Poirot. The idea that like sometimes the detectives solving these mysteries, really the end of the job for them is solving the mystery and getting the information to the authorities. And why am I saying this? Well, Scandinavian noir reminded me that actually, in terms of like understanding and finding out who's committed a murder, the implications of catching a murderer are different depending on which country you're in, because of course the criminal justice systems are different. And I just wonder how that affects the sort of interpretation of a murder mystery. Like if you have a detective working in a country or a setting where, okay, you've caught the criminal, now they're going to be executed. It's a different setting, and it has a very different meaning for the culprit than a setting where they will have to face like prolonged jail time, or if they'll have to face a very different kind of sentence like they might be expected to face in modern day Sweden.
That's a very good point, actually. A good thing to consider, to take away as we sign off, for I think we have now run out of time. But thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.